My name is Mike Herschel. This is useful tips, tricks, and techniques that will help you front-end the Drupal better. And this is the first time I'm giving this presentation, so I apologize. So the genesis of this is me, there's certain things that newbies and intermediate developers coming in to do Drupal front-end development, they have problems with. Like some of that thing is understanding the JavaScript behavior system. Some of it is understanding how to know what to type when you're typing in your Twig templates and stuff like that. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about that, and it's hopefully going to be a little illuminating. The things I'm going to talk about are kind of unrelated, but so little mini sessions. So this is me. I'm Mike Herschel. I'm in Gainesville, Florida. That's me and my dog, Dexter, and my daughter, Millie. There's actually a dog that I love better than Dexter outside of the picture. But yeah, this is what I do in Florida. That's a real picture after I caused a little chaos. I work for Lullabot. Lullabot is a development strategy design firm. We work with a lot of big clients here in the state of Georgia. We have done work with Turner. We have done work with the state of Georgia, upgrading a lot of their websites, and we're doing a lot of work with Georgia Public Broadcasting. We also have a new support and maintenance department, so if you're looking for that type of thing, you can ask me about it. So here I'm going to give you a quick overview. So the intended audience of this is kind of beginner to intermediate developers. But even if you're more advanced than that, you might catch something pretty cool in here. We're going to talk about disabling caches, because when you're new into Drupal and you try to disable, Drupal has something like 6,000 layers of caching. We're going to talk about template debugging, debugging Twig within Xdebug, which is going to be the meat of it. And I think that's the one that's going to help out most people. We're going to talk about the Drupal behavior system, which is how Drupal processes JavaScript and why that works and why that's important. And then if we have time, we're just going to talk about just some helper modules and things like that. So before I get started here, let me get a show of hands. Who here is front-end developer or does work on the Drupal front end? That's awesome. Anyone also considers themselves a back-end developer? Is anyone here kind of just hanging out? All right. All right. So I'm going to go into a bunch of live demos right here. And I have a couple sites set up, and we're just going to pray that these are working. But I tested them, so I'm pretty confident they are. So, disabling caching. When you're new to Drupal, one of the most difficult things is just seeing the changes that you make within your Twig templates without having to do a drush CR or anything like that, right? So it's honestly kind of straightforward to do, but there's a couple things, a couple different things to do. So I'm having the code base for lullabot.com pulled up right here. And right now caching is, I have a local set up right here. And I think I have caching disabled, so I'm going to show you what that looks like here, because go ahead. You need it bigger. That's smart. Thank you. So Drupal, by default, has a settings.php right here. And the settings.php has secrets in there, things like your database password and things like that. At the end of your settings.php, there is an option to load a settings.local.php. By default, this is commented out. And what this does is, if it sees a file called settings.local.php, it'll include that, right? So that's pretty straightforward. So your settings.local.php will hopefully include all your settings right here. And it'll have things like the database password, which for me is really, really, super security. So there's a couple settings in here to disable caching right here. And I'm gonna walk through some of these things right here. So the first thing is there's this container YAML setting right here. And by default, Drupal will include what's called a development .services.yaml file. Let's look at that right here. So this is development.services.yaml right here. And what this does is this defines basically a null cache. So when Drupal tries to cache something, it'll just go into nothing. And but if you want to do like any type of disabling Twig caching, you have to add a couple things into this. You have to add like this Twig config stuff in here that says debug true, cache false, auto reload true. This debug true just turns on the template debugging, which we'll talk about later. But what I tend to do is I move this into a different file, and in this particular case, it's called custom.services.yaml. And the reason that I'm doing that is because every time you, like if you just modify the development.services.yaml, next time you update Drupal, it's going to overwrite that. And that's extremely annoying. There's an issue to include this stuff like the Twig debug stuff directly into the development.services.yaml, but it's kind of stalled because once you add HTML comments in there, it breaks any type of RSS integrations, and some people have this enabled by default on their even on their production websites, which is bad practice. So once you point your container YAMLs to your custom services.yaml or development.services.yaml, you can basically set your caches to cache.backend.null. And so you can see there's render cache, page cache, and dynamic page cache, and you point these to nothing, and at that point Drupal is not caching anything. Your local host is going to be a heck of a lot slower, but that's okay, because if you make a change to a Twig file, it's going to show up like that. You don't have to do a drush CR, and you're not going to be wondering. And you can also do things, of course, in here like disable CSS and JavaScript aggregation in here. So yeah, a couple other things that are just like kind of helpful in here is this will be commented out by default, but like you can turn on your verbose errors, and what that will do is if PHP completely dies, as it does typically when you're doing development, instead of giving you a standard white screen of death, it will actually spit out the PHP errors, which is like, that's what we want to see. So yeah, that's basically the first thing right there that a lot of people have problems with, and so let's kind of move on here.
I want to point out that in your settings, you had your debug to throw out the cache headers in there. Just a warning that if your site is very big, you will break your Apache server.
Okay.
There's a bug. There's basically a bug in core that says it can produce header files that are longer than Apache accepts, and it's a terrible bug to try to figure out because you get like this strange error message from Apache.
You just taught me something. I haven't run into that yet, but yeah. So all right. So that was what line was that?
It wasn't in this file. It was in your settings.
Your development services YAML file.
Yeah, or custom services. Yeah.
The parameter.
Right here. Gotcha. So this, just for the recording's sake, this particular line right here can trigger a bug where Drupal creates a very long HTTP header that can crash Apache, makes it very difficult to debug, and yeah. Okay. Moving on to some other things. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is Twig debugging. So when I say Twig debugging here, I'm initially just going to talk about template debugging. So template debugging, like Drupal calls it Twig debugging, which is kind of weird because it's more like finding whatever template that you're looking for. So this kind of builds off of that, but there's this debug true key right here within this YAML file. And when you turn this on, if you go to my local site here, and I might have to enable I disabled my HTML comments in DevTools because it's nice to be able to kind of move around, and I'll show you how to do that. You can kind of see these HTML comments happen right here, and it shows you a couple cool things. It shows you, number one, what template is currently being used. You can see that this is being generated by the html.html.twig, but I can override that with html-front.html.twig. And I can kind of just go ahead and maybe navigate around. Go ahead. Oh, bigger. Thank you, sir. So I can navigate to something and kind of work my, I didn't mean navigate. I can work my way up from here and kind of see what templates are being output. So this is useful. So at this point, what I can do is, I know I'm using field.html.twig. I can pull that up in my code editor, and I can affect that markup immediately. I mentioned earlier that I frequently, like, if you're doing like maybe like some type of CSS development and you're trying to maybe drag stuff around and just work with it, it's kind of nice to disable comments. And I'm just going to give like a little quick Chrome Developer Tools tip. If you're on a Mac, and I know there's a keyboard shortcut for Windows or Linux, but on Mac it's Command-Shift-P, and it opens up a command palette. And it's very similar to what you can do with VS Code or Sublime text editor. And at this point, you can do things like disable JavaScript or hide HTML comments. It does a funny search, a fuzzy search, so you can kind of just do that. You can switch to themes too and things like that. Command-Shift-P. So when I get into, if I'm over here and I look at the template, let me show HTML comments, and I see I'm in field-li, I can go into VS Code, and if you hit Command-P, you can, of course, switch files, field-li, and then I can just go to whatever file that it is right here and easily affect that file. So that's pretty cool. So you can do that template debugging in Drupal 7 if you're in the later versions of Drupal 7 too. You have to Google on exactly how to do that, but if you're working on a D7 site. Moving on here. Any questions based on this? Moving on, and this is, I'm trying to spend most time doing the actual Xdebug debugging here, because when people move into Twig, they say this is easy. It's curly brackets. It's, you know, percent signs in this with if sign. Like, Twig syntax is fairly easy by default. Like, you just print something, or you do a for loop, or you do an if loop. It's not complicated. But then people try to figure out what to type, like when they're trying to do fields and stuff. And that is a real pain in the ass, especially if you want to do it maybe without like the field markup around it or something like that, right? Or you're trying to do something special, or you just want to maybe extract, say, the URL out of a link field or something like that. That's really, really difficult. So each one of those things has a formula to do it, you know, where you can extract that. But what this section of the presentation is going to do is it's going to mainly like show you how to get to that formula. So it's more like teaching you how to fish as opposed to throwing you a fish at you, you know. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use Xdebug. Has anyone who here has used Xdebug in the past? All right, so we have 2 or 3 and a half. Yeah, half. Who here has done it with Twig templates? We have 2. That's awesome. And a half. All right. I'm just. And so I'm going to show you that, and we're going to do it with PHP Storm. I'm going to show you like a technique where you can kind of traverse, your entities and get fields from maybe a reference entity. So the particular use case that I'm going to do right here, let me go to my local here. Oh, thanks you. That's a great question. Xdebug is built in, well, it's not built, it's an extension for PHP, and what it enables you to do is stop the PHP process and inspect the variables during mid-execution. And you're going to kind of see this as it goes, as it happens. So what we're going to do right here is we're going to go into an episode node. And what I'm going to do is I am going to traverse some entities. So this, let me log in right here. Well, I'm not logged in, but don't worry about it. So this has like a field called field audio media that is an entity reference to a media item. That is, the media has a file entity reference to the MP3 file. So we have multiple entity references, and what I am going to try to do right here is I am going to try to get the path to this MP3 right here, because there's an MP3 for this podcast. So so a lot of people use things like DDev and Lando. I use MAMP because DDev and Lando Docker has some performance issues on Mac OS, but all of these solutions support Xdebug. I like MAMP Pro because within MAMP Pro, you can go into the PHP settings and you can check this box right here that says Xdebug. Xdebug can be like a real pain to configure, and I'm not going to, this session is not going to set you up doing that, but you can Google how to configure Xdebug for whatever my local is. Go through that pain, it's worth it. So you configure Xdebug right here, and I'm also going to be using PHP Storm. PHP Storm is a IDE especially for PHP, and it has really good built-in Xdebug support, and I like it because you can do this thing called live expressions. Now, if you don't have the money for PHP Storm, which is something like about $100 a year, you can use VS Code, which is free, and there's Xdebug extensions for VS Code. I tend to use them both, but if I go into VS Code and I just do a search for Xdebug, I'm gonna see some things right here, and I don't know which one's the best, but that's possible too. So now I am in PHP Storm right here, and you can see I have my project pulled up and everything like that. And before I do anything, I'm going to zoom in. So the first thing I'm going to do is I already have opened the episode template right here. So I used, imagine that I used template debugging to find out that this is the node --episode --full. And at this point, I just have a bunch of markup in here. Most of it's just hard-coded in here. So what I am going to do is, so I want to print out the path. I want to traverse all these entities and entity relationships and get the path to this MP3 file. So if you install the Devel module, it enables, so the Devel module, if you're not using it, is this amazing module that's really helpful for Drupal development. And you just install it like any other module. It enables a bunch of functionality. One of the cool functionalities it enables breakpoints in Twig. So I'm going to just type in devel_breakpoint. Now, the later version of PHP Storm has native Twig breakpoints, but I haven't got that to work because I haven't configured it. So I just use this. So you type in Devel breakpoint somewhere in your file, and there's this little telephone icon in the top right up here. Hold on. Right up here. And you hit this button so it goes green. You make sure that Xdebug is working, you make sure that your cache is either disabled or clear, because this template will not be parsed if it's just pulling it out of cache. And at that point, you reload your web page, sip your coffee, and wait about maybe 20 seconds, and it should break here. Larry broke, cool. So what it's going to do is it'll switch over to this debug.php file over here. But that doesn't matter because we're still over here. That's just where it broke. And so you're going to see right down here, this is everything that's available to PHP in this, like right now. But everything that's available to Twig is under this context array. So you have context right here. And this is everything. So you're going to see things like the title, the URL. So I can just do like, I could do things like URL, and that will print out the URL to this, because you can see that here. I can print out page, and that will print out true. Or I think I could do, you get the general idea right here. Like the podcast image URI will print this out. So now within Drupal 7, what you could do is if you're doing any type of debugging in Drupal 7 and PHP template, you can typically start like traversing this. You know, you can start navigating around and maybe see the data that you want, and then you can right click on it and go to copy copy name, and it'll just do stuff, right? So what we want to do is we want to get, of course, the path to the MP3 file. So we know it's under field audio media. I don't know if you can see that right there. I don't even know if I could zoom in. I'm hitting Command+, that doesn't work. So this right here says field audio media, and I go under here, and I see a bunch of like hash items. It's obviously a render array. And I look down here, and I'm trying to grab it, and I don't see it. You know, it's like a it's kind of weird because it's a render array and it pulls it out, but we can't quite see it. So how are we going to do this, right? So now this is where if you're a Drupal front ender, you start like punching your monitor, and that is like one valid way to do stuff, but there might be a better way. So if we're using Xdebug, what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on this right here. I'm going to go to evaluate expression right here. And you can hit enter on here, and you can start typing stuff in here. And you can start looking around, you know. Now, if you're using things like Kint or DPM, you have to reload every time you do that. And you can see how quick this is right here where you're evaluating expressions. It's pretty quick. We're actually going to go into Node because there's a Node object here, and we're just going to output that. So we can do things like, let's see, copy value, paste. Or no, that's not what we want. We don't want to copy the value. We want to copy the name. I don't know if I can make it. Well, you know, maybe I can go into my settings here, system preferences. Yeah, that's better, right? Yeah. So we're going to go down into the node object right here. And so we have a node object, and we can see fields right here. And we can see like things like, we can see all the different fields that we have, including, there should be like a field audio media, right? So and that didn't work. So what we do is we can do methods right here. So there's a method called getFields, I think, that basically lists all those same fields right there. But what you can do is there's also like, I don't know if it's quite a method or some other type of object where you can just type in the name of a field. And this is just one of those things that you have to remember. You can type in the name of a field right here, field audio media. And now this gets you to that field. But you can still not see everything right here. You can see this and this. But we know that it is an entity reference. So the one thing to remember is type in the name of the field, and now you type in entity. You have to just know this. It's part of the entity API. You can't browse to it. And once you're in the entity, so now we're on the media entity item. And you can see at the top right here, it's coming from Drupal media, entity media. And we need to know what the fields are, so we can once more, again, do get fields. And we can look to see what the fields are of this media entity. And at the bottom right here, this kind of looks promising right here. We can see field media audio file. That's what we're looking for, right? We're looking for the path to this MP3 file. Now, keep in mind, if you're doing this with Kint or you're doing this with DPM, you have to reload every time, and then you have to start browsing down. It gets pretty painful. So at this point, we can see all this type of stuff, but we still don't see what we're looking for. But we know it's a entity reference, so we put entity. You can see we're traversing pretty far deep now. We're going kind of deep into the Drupalisms. We're going through 2 entity references to the data that we want. So we go through entity again, and now we do, once again, get fields to see what's there. And now we see some fields, and we can see this URI field right here. And we can actually kind of see what we're looking for right here. That's not quite right, but it's getting close, right? But how do we get down to here? So and this is like some Drupal entity API magic. You just have to know this, and you have to like get in here and practice it. But you can type in, remember these are fields right here. So we want the field for URI. So now we're at this URI right here. And once again, we can kind of see the data that we're looking for right down here. Now, with this type of thing, more entity API kind of magic, that you can type in value here. And so this gives us very close to the information that we want. I'm going to copy this whole thing. And now I'm going to show you how to throw this into Twig. Because this isn't Twig. So there's a couple things that we can do here. We can throw this into template preprocess with just normal PHP by copying this into your themename.theme file. Instead of doing context, you would just reference the node object, and you can set a value that way. But let's assume that we want to maybe clutter up our Twig files and do some stuff in there. So I'm going to copy this. I'm just going to turn off. I got the information I need right here, so I'm going to turn all this stuff off. Get out of that. I'm going to zoom out so I can see it a little bit. I'm going to go down to underneath this header. Oop, that's not what I want. And I am going to create a comment and paste the stuff in here, because that's what we're going to look for. That's what we're going to do. So under here, we have access to everything under context directly. Now with Twig, you don't, of course, use these arrows. You replace everything with dots, right? So basically, what we're going to do is I'm just going to copy everything from node on. And replace everything with dots. And then we're going to continue on, and we're going to see where we're at right here, right? So now we're doing like Twig syntax right here. You can kind of, you get how that's working, right? So now I have PHP Storm. It is not listening for connections. So now I'm going to refresh this. And hopefully I'll see that path. It's just going to show, right here it is. That's not exactly what we want right there. We want like the full path, right? But that's easy from now on because what we have is there's some built-in Drupal Twig functions. So we do like Drupal Twig functions. And there's just one in here called path. And you can just get like familiar with these. Or file URL, this would work right here. So at this point, we're just going to wrap this guy in this. We're going to refresh, and it should show up immediately because we have all caching disabled. And there's the path to the MP3 file. So we went pretty deep on doing this. It's a real pain in the ass to like be able to figure that out. But the point that I'm trying to impart is that set up Xdebug, learn the littlest bit of the entity API so you can traverse entities and get this information. And at that point, you can get the information that you want. And you're going to need to like practice this and kind of move it around, right? Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm going to turn this back on. And I have to, it doesn't matter really where you put it, but so we'll have to get it to break again. So we're going to refresh. And it should break. There we go. Break. Debug.php. How do I bring it up here? There it is. There you go. Drag it up. There we are. So you go to the debugger tab right here. And then you have your context. You go down to context. Now you can just right click on something like this and go to evaluate expression. Does that make sense? Yeah, that is PHP Storm. Now there are, yeah, everything's, I don't know that every IDE has that. But so if you're looking at something like VS Code, just Google, how to use Xdebug and PHP and VS Code, and someone will have a YouTube video. You had a question?
Yes. So this is Xdebug set up like the DDEV and PHP Storm.
This is not using DDEV. I'm using MAMP Pro, but DDEV supports Xdebug, as does Lando, as does pretty much every PHP MAMP environment will support Xdebug. You're going to have to go through their documentation and or tutorials to set up Xdebug. Especially for DDEV, the person to bother about that is Mike Anello.
So when you're how do you learn the different entities for you to kind of drill down each level like that? Like that's the part to me like.
So there's a couple different things right here. Like if you're going through the node object, and the node object is going to be kind of weird because like you're basically using the entity API. And the three things to remember are get fields. And then if you have a field, like you can see I have a field name called field episode number. You can type in field episode number. And if it's an entity reference, you can do entity here. This will not work because it's not, this particular field is not an entity reference. But if it is, you put entity after that, and then you do another get fields, and you start traversing your way down. You're learning it right now.
One thing about PHP Storm, if you don't want to pay the $100 a year, you can do the EAP program. It's free. Okay,
so for the sake of the recording, if you can't do the $100 a year, there's an EAP program with PHP Storm. What is EAP?
It's early adopter. Basically, you're
early adopter. So you get That's kind of cool.
Yeah, but you don't have to pay for it. And basically you use it forever.
Yeah, that's awesome. Gloria? I didn't hear you. You want to go down to entity reference one more time? All right, so we know it was field audio media. We just remember that. So now we're in entity. Now this particular field, this field audio this field audio media is an entity reference to a media entity. So what we will need to remember how to do now is we will remember to type an entity because we know that. And that will bring up this whole other array of objects and everything that has that. Does that answer your question?
I already knew that. I'm just wondering if it says it at all in the list.
I don't think it does. Let's check.
I know that it tells you the value always, but I don't think
It's not like
Yeah, it doesn't. All it shows is like this target ID right here. So the only way to get that path to the MP3 file is by traversing the entities. Go ahead.
So you see the comments that are beside each field name. Does any of that mention the type that it is, some sort of reference?
That's a good question. I honestly don't know the answer to that. So the question is,
and that's all part of the content type in there.
You can actually find this stuff in the entity reference item class. It should tell you that there's an entity value and a regular value for the entity reference.
So that first one says it's a reference.
yeah, right here.
Right. So if you go to a field that does not have an entity reference, does it have?
Oh yeah. Well, let's check it out here. Get fields. What was it?
Yeah, underscore there.
So we'll go into.
So right here, does it show?
Oh yeah, right here it says entity reference right there. Because field authors is also an entity reference. Cool. Yeah, I actually just never know that. Like the way that I typically do it is just by going to manage fields within the UI. Yeah. So my experience, just for the background, is like I am a front end developer. I do very crappy PHP, and when I write PHP, I typically make sure I have my coworkers review my code, and then I learn. Go ahead.
So I was going to say, I do a sort of similar thing when I'm trying to parse all the data and stuff, but rather than going through PHP Storm, I just invoke some hooks, or you can also find the corresponding PHP file along with your Twig template, and I'll just do a dump of $$ or whatever, and it'll spit out a JSON file, or not JSON file, but a JSON feed on your page. That's exactly the same sort of thing, and you can hit the arrows and traverse that.
That's kind of cool. My understanding is sometimes that will it'll be very large. I like this because it's very fluid.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like the way you're drilling down with the search versus Kent, where you're just you just gotta keep hitting the plus sign,
So I'm gonna move on.
Going back to kind of how you figured it out, you could also ask for the type. So if you get the entity, so I've got an entity reference field, I get the entity, you can ask for the type, and it should tell you the type, and then the Drupal API will have, you can look up that type in the Drupal API and see all the functions and everything.
So I'm going to move on. We got, I think, 10 minutes-ish. I want to talk a little bit about Drupal behaviors. Does everybody know what who here has a firm understanding, a firm grasp of what Drupal JavaScript behaviors are? You got 2. That's pretty good. So, no. And what I say to that is liars. So I want to explain the problem, and then we are going to talk about how it's what the solution is, right? So hold on one second. I'm gonna maybe get back into my settings here and maybe make this a bit bigger. Ooh, what happened? Sure, that'll work. So, right here, we have the ignore, turn off, and command quit. So right here we have the umami test profile. I don't know if anybody's played with this right here. So I created this view right here, and it uses Ajax to Ajax in this data over here, right? So it's Ajaxing in the results of the view. It doesn't do a full page reload or anything like that. So let's say we have some JavaScript. As the page loads, we want to go through all these and maybe modify them to insert some funny emojis through JavaScript or some crap, or maybe insert some buttons, maybe do some accessibility stuff. And we do that on the page load, and that works great. You know, you can do that. It just works. But what happens when data is Ajaxed in? The new data that comes in will not the new data that comes in will not have that JavaScript applied to it, right? And so that is the problem that Drupal Behaviors solves. So what Drupal Behaviors does is Drupal will run, you basically register all the JavaScript within these, quote, I think it's an array of behaviors. It might be not, I don't know. And every time that Drupal does an Ajax operation, it will run this JavaScript just for that little part of the data that comes in. It'll pass in what's called the context variable, or not a context object. And I'm going to kind of show that to you just a little bit right here. So once again, the goal of this is to have the JavaScript apply to the data that gets Ajaxed in. But it's also a little weird because sometimes if you use Drupal Behaviors, your JavaScript runs twice, but you only want it to run once. And then you end up with things like multiple event listeners. You know, you might have I want to do a click event listener on this button, but then your Drupal will load and it'll maybe execute behavior several times. And at that point, you have multiple event listeners attached to this one button. So if you click on it, it goes ba 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 all at once, and you're like, "What the heck is going on? Drupal is dumb." So I'm gonna kind of we have 5 minutes here, and I'm just gonna show you that a little bit here. So I just modified this umami theme JavaScript right here, and so this is what Drupal Behaviors looks like right here. And I created one called Mike. Right? So this is at least the client side of Drupal Behaviors. There's a little bit more that goes into it. So what you do is you copy, not this part, but you copy this scaffolding right here, and then each behavior you'll name something different. So you'll maybe name this one menu, or this one social sharing or something like that. It doesn't really matter what you name it, except for the fact if you're doing JavaScript debugging, you can look at your stack trace and see where it's coming from. But there's a couple things that are happening right here. When you're passing this data in right here, it passes in this context variable. When your page loads for the very first time, context is equal to your whole document. You know, so context is this whole document. So when you do things say document.querySelector, and you're looking for your button, that's the same thing as doing context.querySelector for your button if you're attaching event listeners to that or something like that. But that's the same thing on page load, right? Or that's only on page load. Now, if you're doing an Ajax operation, context is not equal to the document. It's equal to whatever, the wrapper of the data that's being inserted in there. So let's say I have this like I'm attaching let's say I'm attaching an event listener to all the buttons. I can do things like this and like say button dot at, or you would do an all here button for each, and then you would say like element that add event listener and all the rest right here. So what this will do is this will run every single time. It will initially run when the pages load, and it'll get all the buttons that are on the initial document. But then if you do an AJAX operation, that context right here is equal to the data that comes in, and it's only going to attach this to that data that comes in. Does that kind of make sense? Am I explaining this like somewhat good? I see like some smiles and some shaking of the heads. It's kind of a complex. It's very complex.
I guess the other way to say it is if your AJAX call adds a button to the page.
Yeah.
Which would not get that listener because.
Yeah, because the AJAX. Yeah. If you're AJAXing in a new button, it's not going to have any event listeners on it because it wasn't there when the JavaScript initially executed. So the JavaScript needs to execute again, but only for that new button. So that's like, it's kind of complicated, right? So, but sometimes you want to only run it once. You might want to run it only on page load. So you can either take it out of behaviors, or you can do things like do an if statement right here that says if context is equal to the document. So that basically says if it's on the initial page load, then you can do stuff. So I added these console logs in here, and you can kind of see that in action. Go ahead, Gloria.
Why would you use that over like jQuery.once?
Well, in this particular case, I'm not using jQuery, but jQuery once does a very similar thing. Go ahead.
All right, so there's one part that's a bit abstract there. You mentioned that what comes in this context the next time it runs is the wrapper. Where are you specifying what the wrapper is?
That is specified within the module that's AJAXing in the data. Like if you're using like views load more or something and it's AJAXing in the data, the views load more JavaScript will call like the Drupal behaviors init and pass in that information right there. So when I load this up initial right here, you can see this one that says I'm outside Drupal behaviors will only run once. This log that says I'm within a Drupal behavior, but it's going to run every time behaviors run. You can see this ran 1, 2, 3 times. And it's running multiple behaviors because probably some of this stuff, some of the admin toolbar is running behaviors. What's that? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. BigPipe might. I don't know how that interacts. But you can kind of see the thing that I put within that if context equals document, that will run only once. So that's just kind of a technique, and you can kind of play with it. You can also, I'm a big fan, if you're not too familiar with JavaScript debugging, it's a great way to learn. So this is called mainmenu.js. You can see these shortcuts are right here. Command P, main menu, is it main underscore menu? Main dash menu. I don't know where it's at. Anyway, you can usually open it and set a breakpoint there. And another way to do that, just FYI. Oh, that's why. I can't even, I did karaoke last night, and I might have went too far on the karaoke. But anyway, you can also type in debugger in this, and it'll also break. And I'm a big fan of let me hold shift, reload. Yeah. All right. I don't know what's going on. Anyway, but learning proper JavaScript debugging is a whole another thing, but like it's easy. Everybody should do it. And I'm kind of like 1 minute over time. Does anybody have any other questions? I would guess less than that. Utsu is the guy who's doing that. I don't know how quick he does it. Yeah. Yeah, and that's a pain in the butt. Go ahead. Oh, Wampy's article, yes. Wampy Drupal Behaviors. This is one of the most popular articles on lullabot.com. Understanding Drupal, JavaScript behaviors in Drupal. And he talks about it. And what's interesting in here is he uses an example from when he was doing my code review from this is like 4 or 5 year old article here, but it's valid for Drupal 8 even though it's like Drupal 7. And he talks about stepping through everything like that. And this is an amazing article right here. So, yeah. Wampy is amazing, by the way. If you all don't know him, he's in Spain. So, go ahead, Gloria. Mm-hmm. No, the global Drupal settings is just like an alias or a reference to the global Drupal settings. No, it just saves maybe bytes. I don't know, whatever.
Just
You can if you in your Ajax callback for infinite scroll, for example, it may manage the offset in your items, so you can add things to Drupal settings and it will redefine the settings object on the client side so that you can pass information back and forth through the Ajax callbacks. So it sort of reassembles.
So you can change it through Ajax.
You can change Drupal settings.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can add stuff to it and improve and then it will be added back to the client.
Okay, cool.
All right, everybody. Thank you.